quick reminder, each episode could contain some game spoilers, so please listen or watch with discretion. And now, your hosts for the Gamer's Advocate, AMKomnenos, Banana, and Legion. Enjoy the show.
Welcome to another one of the Gamer's Advocate podcast shows. Today, we discuss many things, and if you get 1,000 gamers in a room, you probably get 1,000 different opinions. We like to discuss them all. But whether it's games that we love, games we hate, games we love to hate and hate to love, we're going to discuss them. So today, we're going to be talking about Final Fantasy, which I don't know if you two know anything about Final Fantasy, but you know, in a day and age where a lot of people, right. In a day and age where a lot of people have already played it, or maybe played one or two games, maybe more the recent ones, where would you suggest that someone new to the game, what games would they want to start with?
I think Final Fantasy, it's in a unique position amongst game series, or close to unique. Persona would be similar, in that every game, roughly speaking, is entirely standalone. So you don't have to start in order, you don't have to start with a certain entry. So you do essentially have the whole catalog appears directly in front of you, and you get to decide where to start. But I suppose that's a two-edged sword, because you now have all of this choice, but you also have that Steam library paralysis of choice at the same time. Where could I begin? Where do I begin? So for me, you've got the entire catalog in front of you. If I had to say in sort of one sentence before getting into it, which one? Start with Final Fantasy X. Banana?
So yeah, I agree that we've mentioned previously every Final Fantasy game is different. Even when they started making sequels, Final Fantasy X to Final Fantasy X-2, they are very different games. The 13 trilogy, each game is a little different. So you can really jump in anywhere. My recommendation overall would be Final Fantasy 15. I think it was their attempt to create a mass appeal game for people who have played Final Fantasy as well as people who were new to the series. So I think it works very well as an introduction to Final Fantasy.
Now, when I remember when Final Fantasy 15 came out, and I wonder how much of this is just the same thing you can say about almost every video game in a series that comes out. That knee-jerk vitriolic reaction that you get primarily online. Hey, everyone. And I remember that the game was quite widely, not heavily criticized, but lightly criticized. And this would generally be that it didn't feel like a Final Fantasy game. It felt incomplete. It felt like Road Trip Simulator, something we've discussed before. Rather than having the Uematsu main theme, you had the cover of Benny King's Stand By Me. And bearing in mind how many criticisms it got for being almost out of genre, according to these people at the time, are you sure it's a good place to start?
I think so. That was one of those things where I think overwhelmingly the response where people felt like it wasn't a Final Fantasy game came from people who had played every game in the series. And when you get that criticism from your long-standing player base where they're just saying, well, this doesn't feel like every game previous to it, it's almost a compliment. Because like the developers explicitly said, it's not supposed to. Like, we are trying to create a game that captures the audience that we've never been able to appeal to previously. We're trying to reconcile that new game with our existing player base, but we know it's not going to feel exactly the same. And I think, having played through 15 a couple of times now, it's definitely a Final Fantasy game. Like, that criticism doesn't hold up if you play through it. But it is very different. And I think it is different in a way that encourages people who are new to the series, because it's not difficult to get used to. I don't know that any Final Fantasy game is, but I don't know that I think 15 is presented in a way where it's very easy to wrap your head around the controls, mechanics, all of the gameplay elements that you need to kind of figure out in order to get comfortable with the game. And the scaling up from there of building an effective play style and getting good at the game. I think in 15, it's a lot more gentle. It's not like a hard skill floor that you have to meet in order to progress. And I think that's part of the appeal, or that's part of why I would recommend it to people who are getting into the series. Because if you get into some of Final Fantasy VII and you don't want to read through a lot of explanation in the tutorial elements, you'll probably miss certain statuses. You'll probably miss the way things play together, and you might end up struggling against an enemy that relies on those mechanics that you've overlooked. And I don't know that that exists in 15. I feel like even if you are just going to brute force and just attack constantly, you can kind of find a way through that game just using that strategy. That being said, if you want to strategize and you want to figure out game mechanics and most effective tactics, those exist in Final Fantasy 15 as well. I just think it's a very well done game in terms of balancing, so that you don't need to do this kind of critical analysis of gameplay mechanics to progress. You can very much get the story by just focusing on the story and playing through the game as it's presented to you.
If I was a player who was interested in going, introducing myself into the series, and if I was more of a player who likes a combination of activities weaved in with the story, because maybe I'm just not into story games personally, like as my main motivator. I don't know, like a game like Dave the Diver or something, where I can do multiple different things and also, get to know the story as I do. Is there a particular game that would maybe do that better than any of the other ones?
You're going to say something nice about Final Fantasy X too.
Oh, I didn't go down that path. I'll let you do that in a second. I was going to say, if you're looking for a game with the narrative but also other things to do, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, the newest game, is full of mini games, full of side activities, full of other things to do. I believe the story probably would take you about 50 hours-ish if you rush through. Probably a little bit less if you really just beeline story to story to story. But if you include all the mini games, all the side activities, you must be well over 100. Now, we're not talking about the hard mode playthrough. We're talking about just having one go, normal difficulty, playing and completing the mini games. You've got a mini Fallout Guys style game within this. You've got almost a Mario Kart game in the Chocobo racing. You've got a tower defense game in Fort Condor. You've got the motorbike simulator based upon the original game's motorbike simulator. You've got the one that I just forgot, but I was going to talk about because it's the big one, the card game. So in many Final Fantasy series, you have a defined card game. Final Fantasy VIII has Triple Triad. Final Fantasy IX has theirs. And now Rebirth has its own too. So if you want to walk down that path, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth from my mind, but I think Banana apparently has another idea.
I do. Having not played Rebirth, I had to have another idea. I just think it's funny that you say Final Fantasy IX has their card game and just kind of dismiss it, because that's
it's not my favorite.
The appropriate way to handle Final Fantasy IX's card game. It just doesn't make sense. But yeah, like Com said, Rebirth has a lot of those kind of mini game elements where you can find another thing to engage you outside of the story, and you can sink a lot of hours into those other mini games if you want. The answer that I came up with is a bit different, I would say. Final Fantasy X-2 is more or less just a collection of mini games in my mind, even if you are playing the main story. Every new mission that you go on is like a slightly different challenge. There's different mechanics that you have to figure out, and everything is kind of a mini objective, and you do your best to kind of accomplish that in typically a timed manner with kind of common gameplay elements poking through, but ultimately every mission is a little bit different, and some of them are very much just mini games that kind of stand alone and you never revisit that, and some of them are kind of the more what you would expect of, race through this area, fight all these enemies, get to a boss fight and clear that, and you'll have completed your little mission. But overall, the variety in Final Fantasy X-2 is overwhelming. It's everywhere. There's very few missions that kind of follow the same pattern. So every little mini game that you're doing is a little bit different. And it's not a game that I'm particularly fond of, but there are definitely things that they did well, and I think that variety is one of them.
So if I was a new player to the series and I was more worried that I might miss out on context, like personally, I don't watch a lot of superhero movies because by the time things have gotten popular, there's already been 3 or 4 other movies with that character referenced, and they have a totally different character presentation of maybe what I knew maybe from a comic or something, because they've already built a different lore on prior iterations of that series. So would there be like a particular Final Fantasy that maybe I could get my foot in the door and at least not be confused by what happens afterwards?
So with Final Fantasy, I think it is in a very privileged position where the games are generally so narratively unique and standalone that you don't have to worry about accidentally playing out of order, missing context, and the only exceptions to this would be games that are numbered via the same number system. Final Fantasy X and Final Fantasy X-2. Final Fantasy VII and Final Fantasy VII Remake and Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. You're going to have to get that order right. Outside of those, you don't really have to worry about not being in the loop narratively. Despite that, I think Final Fantasy has a lot of conventions that you would do well to know by playing some of the earlier games rather than some of the later. So many of the games, for example, they won't explain status effects and what they are. They assume that you have already played one of these games and you know how poison works. You know how death works, for example, which is a bit odd, the death spell in Final Fantasy games. You know how the gravity spells work, which again can be a bit odd. And if the game you're playing doesn't explain how it works, you might find yourself a little bit confused. You're also going to miss out on some things like in-jokes. So you're going to miss out, the famous one that we've discussed before is the characters Wedge and Biggs, who will almost always appear within the series. So I think you don't have to worry about missing out on the narrative. You don't have to worry about jumping in at the wrong spot, unless you're clearly making a mistake by picking a labeled sequel. But you might do yourself a favor starting earlier in the series, just to get used to some of these conventions and ideas.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. The statuses from game to game are mostly similar. They're maintained throughout the game. There's poison, sleep, silence, and a lot of those curative items or spells that you use to counteract those statuses are maintained throughout the series as well. So like you'll have a spell like Asuna or Panacea that removes these spells, and that's kind of like your catch-all. But then you'll have specific items like eye drops for characters, has darkness, an antidote for poison. Those things are a little more intuitive. But when you get into games where they have a unique status that was introduced in that game, I don't know that it's addressed as much, or if it's kind of taught to you in any kind of tutorial. It's almost kind of assumed that like, yeah, this is the new one, so use the item that you've never heard before to cure this. And that might be the only kind of way that playing through the series in order gives you any kind of advantage. But I agree with everything that Com said, given that overwhelmingly the entries in the series are not connected directly. There's no narrative element that joins everything together. The only things that really seem to kind of continue from game to game are kind of little Easter eggs and secrets for the player to appreciate that you don't need a starting point to really establish. But I would say as far as like the first game that I can remember where those callbacks and Easter eggs were thrown in, seems to start with thanks Kiki. Seems to start with Final Fantasy VII, and then after that there are references to Final Fantasy VII. I don't know of too many that reference games prior to that, but like you'll see a reference to Final Fantasy VII in Final Fantasy IX, and I think there are little kind of hidden elements specifically for players who've played through the entire series that are peppered in throughout games beyond Final Fantasy VII. So if your concern is missing out on that kind of context that makes future games a little more easy to understand or easy to appreciate in those Easter eggs, those little hidden secrets. I would say start with Final Fantasy VII, but overwhelmingly, I'd say you can jump in anywhere in a game that's not part of, you know, a set of sequels or anything like that, and you could be fine.
I do wonder if maybe the reason that we start feeling the existence of these callbacks and allusions to previous games starting with 7 is due to 7 being that first game on that new generation of consoles, that first game with that mass Western appeal as well, that they almost felt that they had to appeal to their roots very directly within the game. And even though this wasn't making it a sequel, they felt that they had to put in lots of small little Easter eggs and little snippets and tidbits that long-term fans of the series would still feel, okay, this game is going out on a different scale, we can almost say, than the previous. But this is still, for me, this is still my Square Soft, I believe at the time. This is still my company. This is still my series of games. And when you were saying that, sort of just about the nods and the winks, it almost reminds me of what we discussed in the very, very first podcast. You don't have to have played Morrowind to enjoy Skyrim. But if you did, you might get that reference to St. Jub, and you might enjoy it just a little bit more.
Right.
That's all you're really going to get from playing the other games. You might enjoy playing your current one a bit more, but that's it.
So would there be a game on y'all's radar that you would definitely tell people, you know, it's a game, but I may not want to start my Final Fantasy playthrough, especially for a new player there. Is there a game or two that you would tell people to kind of avoid? Not because you don't like the game necessarily, but really it serves no purpose to kind of help them appreciate the series.
8. And I don't dislike, well, I don't hate Final Fantasy VIII. I think it's awkward, clumsy, oddly developed, and it doesn't always conform itself to what you would expect it to. For example, leveling up in Final Fantasy VIII is rarely a good idea. Your characters do not strengthen by leveling up. Well, they do, but they don't really strengthen in terms of leveling up. Rather, they level up or they strengthen by you doing certain things with magic within the menu system of the game. The game will explain this to you. But what it's not going to tell you is the enemies around the world scale up with you. So as you level up and get stronger, the enemies get stronger. And if you're not managing this secondary system correctly, and you probably won't on your first playthrough, the game doesn't get easier as you get stronger. It gets harder.
That's exactly.
That's almost teaching you the wrong lesson.
Unless you are managing the level up system in Final Fantasy VIII, enemies scale up faster than you do. So if you're just generally scaling and like leveling all of your characters, the game gets harder. But yeah, I absolutely agree. I would not recommend 8. I have issues with 8 mostly because I hate the story. It's nonsense. I think it's terrible. And I will concede that every Final Fantasy game reaches a point where the story kind of goes off the rails a little bit. Usually it's very close to the end where there are huge leaps and things just don't have to make sense anymore. For 8, that happens about 13 minutes into the game. Like it stops making sense very early on, and then they just run with it. And that's why I would recommend avoiding 8. That being said, I will say, like Final Fantasy 1, and this gets confusing because the release for Final Fantasy games in the US and the release in Japan don't match up. So like Final Fantasy 1, 2, and 3 in Japan are not Final Fantasy 1, 2, and 3 in the US. But Final Fantasy 1 in Japan, which is the original Final Fantasy, I think we've mentioned before, is kind of a generic adventure game. And it's very much developers figuring out what an RPG like that needed to be. And as a result, I think in terms of game design, Final Fantasy 1 is the weakest in the series. I think there are elements of conveyance, of communicating to your player what they need to do next that are missing in Final Fantasy 1 that they eventually kind of mastered in later games. There are also gameplay elements that I think your characters or your players don't figure out in Final Fantasy 1 unless they've really invest time and effort. Things like elemental weaknesses, they're not explicitly laid out for you. There's not typically, I don't remember if there's like a scan spell that tells you an enemy's weakness if you use it. I don't think that's introduced in Final Fantasy 1. But those are all things that, like, as you progress into later games, that spell exists, and then you'll learn how to counter an enemy more effectively. And I think playing through Final Fantasy 1 multiple times, you'll piece that together, but it's not presented to you efficiently enough for you to get that on your first playthrough. Whereas in Final Fantasy X, they immediately introduce you to the idea of elemental pairs being opposites. So you have an idea of what elemental weaknesses are presented by an enemy just from the spells that they use. So if they're casting fire, they're probably weak to ice. Not always, but it's a good assumption. And I don't think that little kind of, hey, here's just a general idea that you might want to use, is presented in earlier games. So I would say going back and trying to get into the series at Final Fantasy 1 is a little more difficult because the game's just not as complete as a game that you might be used to playing now, mostly because it's 30 years old. But I think that age really shows in Final Fantasy 1, whereas if you go back to Final Fantasy 7, which is 27 years old, it still holds up. I mean, it's not beautiful, but it's very much playable, which might not be the case for Final Fantasy 1.
So if I'm want to be more focused on story content, like lore is my thing. Like, again, I don't want to miss out on anything, but maybe where is the game that you would maybe suggest is the hardest hitting lore of so that I can kind of get into the story and start running?
This might have to be a game that I haven't played. So I'm going to have to sort of ask Banana if I'm right. I wonder if the game with the most interesting, the most extensive lore, and if not, I have a backup answer, might be Final Fantasy XIV.
Yeah, that's probably true. I also haven't played 14.
Shit.
Cut this part out.
I think on its release, 14 probably wouldn't have stood out for me in that regard, but they just keep adding things to 14, and every time they add something, the player base seems to really appreciate it. So I feel like 14 has definitely moved in that direction of being the most kind of complete game because they're just always working on it.
So anyone unaware, 14 is the big MMORPG Final Fantasy, which also has a single-player quest line. Or I believe you can play it single-player, but you don't have to.
I was just about to ask for that clarification, but yeah, okay. Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I think that's kind of the element of it that needs to be noted is that, like a lot of MMOs more recently, there's a continuous storyline for the player. And that storyline it's a Final Fantasy story. Like it fits. But I don't know about the world building. I feel like in an MMO, world building becomes much more of a high priority because you have players spending so much time in this world. It just makes sense to kind of give them context of, the places they're visiting, the characters they're interacting with. So I feel like 14 almost has to be the correct answer, but I don't know because I haven't played it.
Yeah, we're in that horrible position of ignorance. So I guess for myself, then there's two answers. There's the two more answers. There's the heartfelt answer and what I think might be the right answer. So the heartfelt answer would be the one with the most interesting lore. Would be Final Fantasy VII, and a lot of it is going to be inside other media, which is a bit of a shame. So you've got the games associated with Final Fantasy VII, games like Crisis Core, games of Cerberus, Dirge of Cerberus, the base game itself. You've got, I believe, a novel or two. I'm sure there's one with Tifa and Aerith. it suddenly appeared in the
I
back
don't
of
know
my
if that's
mind
a
then.
novel as much as it is a fanfic that we can't discuss on the podcast.
Well, good, because I haven't read it either. Um, and then you have the Final Fantasy VII Rebirth and remake games in the series, and they ride heavily on the lore of the previous games. They are incredible standalone games, but if you have that foundation within the lore of the previous games, there's so much more to enjoy. So there's that, but that's my heart speaking because it's my childhood game. The game, I think, with simply and objectively the most interesting lore, the most approachable lore, the game that I think catches your eye almost immediately when you start is probably Final Fantasy XVI, the most recent in the series. And they take an interesting approach to lore, a system I'd love to see expanded into other games. Where, if you think of Mass Effect, you've got I'm going to call it the Mass Effectopedia. The Codex, that's the word. You've got the Codex in Mass Effect that you can open up. What are the Reapers? And you get that beautiful voice telling you what the Reapers are, what is the Citadel, etc. You have that too in Final Fantasy 16, I believe for the first time in the series. But it also constantly evolves. So as events happen to characters, it'll tell you what has now happened to that character. How are they changing? So it's also very manageable as well. These games are huge. They're enormous. And diving in for the first time can be quite overwhelming. This has a deep, thick set of lore, and it's also very approachably managed.
For me, the Final Fantasy game that maybe doesn't have the greatest lore or the most expansive lore, but it's lore that is most closely tied to the player experience is Final Fantasy XII. Final Fantasy XII is very much a game about political intrigue for the most part. So it kind of carries on from Final Fantasy Tactics, which is set in the same world. And it is very much a struggle for power between great nations and the leaders of those nations to kind of assert themselves into positions of untouchable power where they're insured for life. I think because of that, because of the fact that this is very much like how nations play together and the major players in those nations and their motivations, I think it's very, very closely tied to the world building, because learning about a player and their learning about a character and their motivations is very akin to learning about where they come from. So the lore and the story are closely tied together.
That's really interesting. First of all, you always make me want to play Tactics.
Good, you should.
Yeah, I know, and I will. Twice. That's another thing 16 does as well, is it's essentially the lazy way that we can talk about it. And it's in the same way that we would say that a game is the Dark Souls of fantasy, the game is the Dark Souls of the Assassin's Creed series. That lazy comparison. You can say 16 is the Game of Thrones of Final Fantasy. It's political intrigue, it's machinations, it's multiple nations fighting against each other. Bad shit happens to everyone. That kind of story. But also each nation... I don't know. But also, each nation is represented by an individual. And you do see that individual rise, fall, go through bad moments, go through good moments. And it's almost always, if not a direct parallel with, it is directly reflective of the state of that nation at the time. So it's got this wonderful idea of you've got this great big behemoth mark on the map, and that is Nation A. But Nation A is also this person. And it just helps keep them clearly defined, clearly separated, and you can really see how they evolve as the game goes on. Despite you making a great point for Final Fantasy Tactics and Final Fantasy 12, I think it just made me fall more down the rabbit hole that 16 is the one with the lore that you need.
You're probably correct there. I feel like it has to be 12 for me, just because if you play 12 and you don't pay attention to the lore, you won't understand the story. You'll just constantly be running into characters and be like, who the hell is this guy? What does he want? When his motivations have been clearly defined if you've been paying attention. I just was not paying attention on my first playthrough, and I remember going through and just like, oh, it's another guy with weird looking armor. Great. I don't want to deal with this. But yeah, having gone back and looked at Final Fantasy 12 after those moments of like, who is this guy and why should I care? Going back and giving it the attention that it's actually due is a much better playthrough. And I think it's that connection between really experiencing the story because you know the lore and you understand the characters and how they all fit together is what makes me say that 12 has to have like maybe not the best lore, maybe not the most expansive, but it is the most necessary for you to understand.
This makes me want to go back and replay Final Fantasy 13, which I really enjoyed. I played it for the first time about a year and a half, 2 years ago. And it's one of the more panned entries of the main series. I think it's had something of a renaissance in the way people look at it in the last few years. But certainly in its time, it was quite heavily panned by the standards of Final Fantasy games. And what I really loved about that game was the interpersonal relationships. I thought it was one of the better games for that. And when people talked about how, I've forgotten his name, Hope, I believe, was this annoying, whiny kid. I was thinking, yeah, he was. And he should be. This makes sense. He's a little kid, just had his mum die in front of him. Why doesn't he just ask that guy who he thinks killed his mum?
Minutes of the game.
Sorry?
There's just spoilers for the first 8 minutes of the game.
Sorry, everyone, because it's going to get worse. Why does he stay mad at this guy who he thinks killed his mum for almost the entire game when a simple conversation would have cleared up that he didn't? Because he's a kid. And he's not going to go confront who he thinks is the murderer of his mum and say, did you really? Or did you not? Yeah. And it was wonderful.
I'll believe you.
Yeah, you seem legit.
Yeah.
On a interpersonal level, I thought the game did an amazing job, but I did find myself not that interested in the world and not that interested in the story. And I'd love to go back and actually see how interesting that really is.
I feel like that summarized the experience for most people on their first playthrough of Final Fantasy 7 or 13. Is I wasn't that interested in the world. I wasn't that interested in the story because, and I play Final Fantasy games for the story. So playing through Final Fantasy 13 the first time, I was like, what the hell is happening? Because the story is presented to you in a way that's very difficult to understand, in my opinion, at least. There's all of this kind of, they use the term l'Cie, and I never understood what it actually meant.
and fal'Cie.
And fal'Cie, yeah. And there's like these different factions that are opposed to each other, and it's very much depending on remembering which one is which I never did. So like I think my inability to grasp what was happening ruined the playthrough the first time. So I ended up just kind of focusing on a lot of the gameplay and not so much the story. And that's an incomplete game because I'm missing out on a big part of it. Yeah. But I feel like that was a me failure as opposed to a game failure. Unless it's just not presented in a way that's easy to understand. But I'm much more likely to believe that I screwed up rather than...
Although saying that, it's a very small case study here, but we do have 2 out of 2 people who've had a very similar experience playing the game. We've heard common criticism from other players online.
Got it. 100% of people agree with us.
Yeah, this is it. 100% of people agree with us on exactly what we said at all times.
Well, I can definitely appreciate where Banana's coming from with the definition that a game wants to use or a lore series wants to, because I know for myself, when I played Diablo and I returned to the world of Sanctuary, I never associated the world of Sanctuary with where we were. I just kind of thought that's what they called, this is our little sanctuary area or something. I never really realized it was actually the name of the world was called Sanctuary. I never put those 2 together. So even though I had everything in front of me, they never really went out and in a way to kind of make that clear. Like they could have chosen almost any other word really, but that meant to me that we were just like in this little area that was a sanctuary, not the whole world. So I can appreciate that. What is a chocobo? What exactly is a chocobo? Because I think I've seen it ridden, flown, and used as a boat. And so first of all, what is a chocobo? And then do they taste good? Like, can you barbecue a chocobo?
Banana, stop him. Stop him now.
So a
You can
chocobo
do
is
all of those
a
things.
mount in Final Fantasy. And you'll see it in various games, Tactics, Final Fantasy X. There are chocobo knights, who are soldiers who specifically participate in battle while on back of a chocobo. They're essentially the Final Fantasy equivalent of horses. And that's essentially how they exist throughout most of the series. There are games like Final Fantasy VII and Final Fantasy IX where you will essentially create different breeds of chocobos that have different abilities, which is where you get into seeing them cross the ocean on one or fly on another. In 7, you'll have the progression from your basic chocobo is just fast and navigates the world in the same way that the main character does. You're just running over open space. That will get upgraded to a river chocobo, so you can cross little rivers that the main character can't cross. Then you'll breed a mountain chocobo, can cross mountains pretty obviously. And then ocean chocobo to traverse the large expanses of ocean in the Final Fantasy VII world. And finally, a golden chocobo who can cross anything. And that is a side quest within Final Fantasy VII that unlocks very unique materia, like game-breaking materia for most of the main story, which is like why chocobos, I think, got their appeal, because they're directly associated with getting the most powerful items in Final Fantasy VII. In 9, it's kind of its own quest to kind of take your chocobo, who goes through these evolutions kind of along the same lines, but instead of becoming a gold chocobo, he becomes a flying chocobo. But he has his own little story about reaching chocobo paradise, which is their version of heaven where you're not allowed. And it's another, like, immediately highlighting these as helpful allies in your quest, because the progression of getting this chocobo through his story requires you to find a bunch of items that make your own story a lot easier to progress through. And I think that's why Com is not on board with you asking if they're delicious. In every way that chocobos, or in every game that chocobos are introduced to you, they're your friend.
Yeah. You could go through these games and you can talk about, which partner or which member of your team was your favorite member. If you go to 7, was it Barrett? Was it Tifa? Was it Aerith? It's Barrett, by the way, and it should be Barrett. The chocobo should be your favorite. The chocobo does the most for you. The chocobo is there. The chocobo is also, and this Banana forgot, the chocobo is cute. It's just incredibly cute. It's so well designed.
I didn't forget.
How dare
Just
you?
not comfortable talking about it.
Yeah.
It's got
not
that.
as superficial as you are.
Oh, I'm incredibly superficial. I've been called that many times. But I think it has that gameplay element that's almost, and you can't really do this in a world map regularly, so they found a method of making an almost Metroidvania part to their world map by letting you unlock these different chocobos or these new stages of the chocobo, and then you can wall off areas of the world map that the player isn't expected to get to in the main game. As Banana said, the most advanced of these chocobos, the golden chocobo, you do not need it. I don't know if you even need the river one. I don't think you have to do any upgrading
You
of the
can
chocobo
play
at
through
all.
the entire game with just the basic chocobo. The only time you ever need it is to avoid fighting the Midgar Zolom.
Yeah, that's it. And even that, I think technically there's a way around. That's very much a technically, if you time it perfectly. But you're going to want that one. But aside from that, everything else, it's all side content. It's all there for you to essentially break the game, as Banana says, or fight one of the game-breaking bosses later in the game. And I guess that's probably where a lot of the love for them comes from, is they let you break the game. They're your gateway to those most advanced, ridiculous powers. I remember unlocking Knights of the Round for the first time when playing Final Fantasy VII. I don't remember unlocking Neo Bahamut, as good as that is. But I do remember unlocking Knights of the Round for the first time. And the Chocobos let you do that. And the other thing is, well, other two things. One, they have a dance. which I think is in most of the games. And secondly, they help you in battle as well. In Final Fantasy VII, there is a summon. You can summon in a giant chocobo or a little chocobo to come and smash your enemies. So it's not just your friend in the world map, it's your friend in the battle too.
You can recruit them in Final Fantasy Tactics.
Oh, for
and then they
goodness
will
sake.
lay
Right, I'm
an
downloading it
egg,
now.
which might be a different variation of a chocobo. So I think there are 3 in Tactics. And they are not the same 3 as any other game. There's a red, a black, and a yellow chocobo, I think. But yeah, you're exactly right. Like there is no game in the Final Fantasy series in which chocobos are introduced and they're not on your side. They are always helpful to the player, and I think that's where the appreciation for them comes from. Is even if they were kind of introduced as neutral, Cobb said they're very cute, they're immediately endearing, but you add in that benefit where not only are they cute and endearing, but they make the game more enjoyable for you because they either make you more powerful by guiding you to these resources that you can use, or they directly support you in combat.
Yeah, when I was younger, this is a very long time ago, there were arcades that I would go to an arcade, or really a lot of arcade games were kind of everywhere. You go to a hotel and they'd have an arcade room. But there were always one of 3 games that I always looked for. If they had it, that's the one because I was fairly good at them. One was Q*bert, which came toward the end of the whole arcade scene.
Tom doesn't know Q*bert?
Q*bert, yeah. Another one
Maybe
was
it's not European.
Maybe. I've never been European, so.
Another one's kind of a tie between Burger Time, which was just like running across the burger. That or Dig Dug. I kind of liked those 2. But the other one was Joust, and Joust was, you were on like this ostrich looking thing, and the chocobo had always reminded me, because I was like, is that part of that universe because of the whole Final Fantasy about that time, And so I'd always wondered if there was some kind of crossover there. Not that that's a lore question or anything like that, but Joust was this thing where like you could take these birds and they would fly up for a while, and then you'd basically joust with other people, and it was really kind of intricate how you did that. But I'd always kind of wondered, because they always reminded me of that. But
I can offer one last thought, by the way, and this is more of an aside than anything else. But on the note of chocobos being cute, I'm just going to point out Banana, Final Fantasy Rebirth, baby chocobos.
I was going to say they definitely introduced baby chocobos. I think in 9 is the first one where you see.
I think you're right. Yeah.
But like immediately that combination between something you already appreciate because it's on your side and it helps you, and then add in the baby element, and you're just like, oh, I love this thing.
Yeah, I know it's not exactly the right word to use, but I'm going with it. Like my maternal instincts kicked in hard.
So do all chocobos go to this chocobo heaven, or is it just a select few?
I think they all go.
Oh.
Yeah, I think it's more comforting to believe that they all go. It's unlikely, given that chocobo paradise is only mentioned in one game in the series.
I think they all go.
I mean, because it implies if there's a chocobo heaven.
It's called Chocobo Paradise, not Chocobo
Paradise?
Heaven.
Okay. That's different. Totally different then. Yeah. Okay.
But yeah, it's
Gotcha.
in Final Fantasy IX, it's very much presented as like a destination as opposed to like a final reward. So it's not heaven, it's just paradise, and it's attainable within a chocobo's life. So let's not throw religion where it doesn't exist, Legion.
Also, Chocobo Paradise is the friends we made along the way.
Yeah. But it is funny that that chocobo side quest in Final Fantasy IX is also how you encounter the game's most difficult boss, which is another interesting element of like associating chocobos with an optional side quest that's more or less just bonus content for the player. It kind of encourages that natural connection to chocobos. Like, this wouldn't exist if I didn't follow the chocobo side quest. So
let's pull this.
It's more content for me because of chocobos.
Well, let's pull this briefly into that overarching theme of the podcast as well, of really Final Fantasy just as a whole. that's another one of those things that you will miss out on a little bit if you only play one game in the series, or you play a later game in the series. You will still find Chocobos cute. The first time you see one in whatever game you're playing, you will still have that moment when a Chocobo Knight comes up and you see someone on this bird and you think, oh, you still have that. But you won't have your memories from Final Fantasy VII breeding your golden chocobo. You won't remember the ones in 16 with the really cute babies. You won't remember trying to do the balloon course in 10. So it's another just common element across the series where even though you don't have to play them all, playing them all just enhances your playing of the others.
Oh, absolutely. Like, I think if you don't play through the side quest in Final Fantasy VII, you don't find the game's true villain, Joe. Joe is an asshole, and I hate him. Joe, and I think his chocobo is named Teo or something like that. That is the most frustrating rival you have in Final Fantasy VII. Like, you're pissed off at Sephiroth throughout the entire game, but Joe, fuck Joe.
Well, Joe is real. Joe's tangible. For almost the entire game, Sephiroth
Joe's
is
always
hell's square.
better than you too.
And he's always better than you. I didn't play the Pokemon games, but I think it's that kind of rivalry. It's the you're always one step behind Joe.
Yep.
So is there a, and in that same theme, is there a character when you're playing the Final Fantasy series that you would tell, say, a new player to say, when you see this character or this companion, that's you want to gravitate or pay close attention to that one, or maybe somebody who's memorable to you?
I've got one, and it's a main character, and it's from the obvious game that we always talk about. I do think that Cloud is probably the most interesting protagonist in any of these games. And his story, and oddly enough, I feel actually uncomfortable spoiling it, so I'm not going to. His story is not the classic hero's journey. It is the hero's journey, but it's got quite a few modifications, and it's told in a non-linear fashion.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really worth paying attention early on in the game to who he is and who he says he is, and how he actually is perceived by the end of the game. I think he is almost uniquely interesting in that regard. And to think that he came from 1996, 1997 for the original release, so early in the development of video games and interesting stories. Cloud.
Yeah, I agree with that assessment. I think Cloud's character is uniquely engaging in a way that you won't find with other Final Fantasy characters. If I were to recommend one Final Fantasy character to kind of gravitate to, it's kind of a cheating answer, but Sid is in every Final Fantasy game, and he's always kind of an interesting character. He's always kind of this guiding figure. Even in 7, where he becomes a playable character, he's kind of weirdly the voice of reason, which does not suit the personality.
The vulgar voice of reason.
Yeah. But like, yeah, he's, when you meet him, he's always pissed off, but he's pissed off for the right reasons. And then you kind of progress through the story and you just see that like he's been right the entire time.
He's another one of those characters who, interestingly, despite being right, he channels it in such a way that you assume he's wrong. And he does misdirect it. Poor Shira, I think is her name.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that part, not as on board with. But eventually you do kind of see him come around on that and own up to not treating her the way she deserves to be treated. And there's a very human explanation as to, like, I associate her with one of the most painful memories in my life. And she knows the reason I'm treating her this way has nothing to do with her.
Which is still awful. He still shouldn't be doing.
It's not an endearing quality. It's a very human quality, though. Like, it's very realistic to meet somebody in a situation like that, where they behave in a way that doesn't make sense on the surface. And when you dig into it, it becomes relatable.
And misdirected anger is very much a thing. We're like, everyone has done this, not necessarily to that degree, but we've all done this at some point in life. I think, oddly enough, just to clarify as well, Sid, when we say he's in every game, it's a different character. So you don't have a consistent Sid across every game.
It's not the same Sid, but it's always Sid.
Yeah, 16 Sid, by the way. Ooh, beautiful work. Another one from Seven, who I think is very interesting and worth looking at, is the minor character of Dyne, who is a central part of Barrett's main storyline. It's almost what Barrett could have been. I think this is where, honestly, Final Fantasy gets a lot of credit for me in terms of its characters, is they often have just a very, very rich cast. And you very rarely come out at the end of a game thinking, character A, that was my boy. You normally come out with, wow, I liked so many of them. I loved so many of these people and their interactions with each other, which is ultimately what made 15 so interesting for me as well, is it's almost all about the relationships between these characters, between the main four. And it's often perceived negatively online as, I think a phrase I used earlier, it's a road trip simulator. You're in a car, you drive with your friends. That to me was a selling point because they're so good at those interactions between characters and establishing their relationships with each other. So yeah, as I was mentioning earlier, there are a few characters who stand out. Cloud, Sid, Dyne as well for myself. But on the whole, it's a game and a series so full of them, it's almost hard to pick out individuals.
Funny
Despite
you
that,
bring
we've
up,
picked out some individuals.
It's funny you bring up Dyne because I always thought Dyne's story was along the same lines as Vincent's. They are both characters tortured by their past, fixating on their own failures and torturing themselves because of it. So when you first meet Vincent, he is full emo, just living in a basement, thinking about his mistakes. Like that is his entire character when you first meet him. And he just isolates himself from the world and broods. That's his whole personality. And that's kind of Dyne to a degree.
Yeah.
And it's very much when you kind of confront them and force them to return to society that story elements start to play out and events happen, and you get different outcomes, obviously, but like you get a sense of closure to those stories. And I think that's what makes those characters interesting, is you set up their backstory, you give them kind of a dominating characteristic, and then you dig into that and how it impacts the current events.
It's not a phase, Banana.
With Vincent, it was
not.
thankfully.
Yeah. I mean, I
Get
actually
out,
was going
Mom.
to say the exact opposite. With Vincent, it wasn't a phase because he's still that guy all the time. If you watch
Not
the
the way
movie, he's more of that guy.
I say, not the way I read the dialogue. I read it with pep. I read it with a nice bouncy edge to it.
Well, you're
He's in
wrong.
a good mood all day. But I think that's really nice, actually. I've never paired those two characters in my mind. It was always for the obvious reason. It's Barrett and Dyne is the two that I compare to each other. I think it's much more interesting when you compare Vincent and Dyne. It's a very good point.
Well, yeah, I would say Barrett and Dyne are two sides of the same coin. To say you have this horrific event in your past, you have this guilt, how do you handle it? And Barrett and Dyne do that in diametrically opposed ways. And that's what you get when you dig into Barrett's story and you learn about Dyne. You see the way that they handled their guilt from this series of events, and you kind of appreciate the what you know about Barrett up until that point, and you recognize that there's always been this kind of haunting element to his past that he doesn't let people see as much directly. And then you see the opposite end of the spectrum with Dyne, and like that's what Barrett could have been if he did not find a productive way to handle those feelings. And then you dig into Vincent and it's more of Dyne, but now you have more influence to say, all right, Vincent, get your shit together. We have stuff to do. Whereas with Dyne, it's out of your control.
Is there a particular platform you think that handles the series better than another? Like, say, the old Nintendo only could do it its way, right? But PC, I'm not 100% sure, but 14 is probably PC only, right? I mean, it could have.
I think it was on the PS4 as well.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's also available on console. I think every Final Fantasy game is console enabled. for
Yeah,
at least Sony, or Nintendo with the earliest ones. But I think, uh,
I'm sure they have some sort of direct license agreement with Sony that
right,
wouldn't permit them to not have a release on there.
right, and I think you'll see a lot of that with, like, ever since Sony got involved, Final Fantasy has always been available on a Sony platform, and then with the remake of Final Fantasy VII, it was exclusively available on a Sony platform, and then eventually made available on PC.
I guess
Yeah.
that's why I asked, because there's a lot of things that when Sony's involved, it's only exclusive on their stuff for a while. So
Yeah. It's ruined for everyone.
I bought a PlayStation. I'm cool. But which is clearly what they want. Well done them. Is there a sort of best console for enjoy it? No, I wouldn't even say there's a best generation of games. I know sometimes we might say the best generation of Final Fantasy was the PS1 era, maybe it was the Nintendo era. PS1 you'll hear quite a lot because you do have this string of
Because it's the
great
right
games.
answer.
There you go, one after the other. The PS2 era is not bad as well. I think you have 10 and 12 gone to PS2. I'm not sure about 11, so I'm going to leave that up in the air. Also, it doesn't exist, so moving on.
Mhm.
But I don't know if it ever had a single best time or a single best console. I think the great thing about the series is it evolves and it makes use of what is available to it. I guess that would, loosely speaking, say its best console is the PC. Not console. Its best system is the PC because that will continuously adapt itself. It's not a new generation. But no, the joy of the series is the way they change.
how about Kingdom Hearts? Have either of y'all played Kingdom Hearts?
Yeah, no.
Well-
About 15 hours, and I hated it. I don't hate many games. I try to enjoy what I buy. I really didn't have a fun time.
I know quite a few people who have done Kingdom Hearts, and that was their introduction to Final Fantasy. That's the reason why I even bring it up.
And that makes me very happy. And I love that there's that gateway into it in the same way that I thought it was great when Stranger Things had Metallica playing. But great, if that brings more people to listen to that album, if that brings more people to the series, that's wonderful. I think they've had other crossovers as well, haven't they?
Mm-hmm. But I just didn't know how y'all felt about the crossover and whether or not it even dealt with it very well in the Kingdom Hearts game. If you haven't played it, then it's.
I agree with Con. I don't like it. It's not a good game. I think there's just a lot of kind of objective failures in that game, but it's a beloved series, and I think a big part of why it's a beloved series is because there's the Disney characters, which people have nostalgia for, and there's Final Fantasy characters, which people have nostalgia for. So I think like those characters are what allowed them. I haven't played Kingdom Hearts 2 or 3, which I've heard are significantly better games than the first one. But I think the only reason that those exist is because you have played off of nostalgia on the first game, and people are willing to overlook the elements that failed to deliver in Kingdom Hearts. And then you get to Kingdom Hearts 2, and it's a more polished game overall that still brings in that nostalgia of Disney characters and Final Fantasy characters. And I think that was a huge part of why the series overall did well. And I like the idea of Kingdom Hearts existing, but it's
Yeah.
not for me.
I think there's a beautiful thing as well where Kingdom Hearts, and I mean this as a compliment, it reminds me of how weird video gaming can be, and I love the idea that that's there. And I think it might be an urban legend, but I believe the story is that people working for Disney and people working for SquareSoft were in the same building with their offices, and one day they meet in the elevator and just say, "Wouldn't it be weird if we made a game where these characters cross over?" And that's where the snowball starts.
And
And
it
that's
was weird.
almost yeah, the weird snowball. But that weird snowball is almost era defining for me. I don't know if I could imagine that taking place today. Maybe it can, especially with smaller independent studios. Think of Dave the Diver and Dredge. But these two gigantic IPs
Yeah.
just suddenly crossing over into a weird game as well.
Well, I
It's
think
not a straightforward one.
that's something we've talked about with modern gaming in other podcast episodes, that I don't think we'll see developers, particularly developers who have established properties, take risks like that anymore. I don't know that you'll see somebody try something so tremendously new that might have very negative consequences for them with an established IP. I
Yeah.
think people recognize that there's a lot on the line and they don't want to screw it up, so they tend to play it safe.
You might also see very, very clearly delineated marks between corporate ownership of IPs as well. So if something is owned by Sony or Nintendo, they are never going to. Oh, I'll say it. That Smash Brothers maybe. As a rule, they're probably not going to come together and suddenly make a game and have it be released on both their platforms equally, with them putting half the developers in each. That just doesn't feel like it's going to happen, which feels like such a shame because I want that game. I want WWE meets Red Dead Redemption 2. Like, I'm desperate for that. But I wonder if that was a very unique moment in history, that Kingdom Hearts moment.
I also don't know if you see the opportunity as much outside. Well, I think we look at Disney and Square Enix at the time, and we wouldn't have seen that possibility then, just because it's a very strange idea. But if you look at existing IPs at this point, like, do you see another group or pairing that could work? I wouldn't have said that about Kingdom Hearts, but someone
Luckily,
did.
luckily they're owned by the same company. I say luckily in inverted commas. Star Wars and Marvel. I could imagine them being forced together. I'm not necessarily saying it would work and that it's a great idea, but I could imagine them being forced into the same game.
Yeah, I think I could imagine them being forced into the same game, and I wouldn't have no interest in it.
Well, you won't see an Aliens versus Predator anytime soon because those are two different films.
Great example.
That own those two. But a lot of people have saying that how they're canonized together, and it's like, well, technically not anymore if they ever were before, because it's two very different studios that own them now. So it's impossible.
Oh, I've just on the same note, Dead by Daylight. Who owns all of those villains in that game? Because can't you play as the girl from The Ring, and you can play as Jason?
So, Behavior, the developers for Dead by Daylight, license killers from other franchises. So you'll see it in, because that's a game that runs off of cosmetics and microtransactions and players buying things to kind of customize gameplay without actually impacting gameplay. And you'll see it with the licensed killers. There's much less customization because Behavior doesn't own the design. So like there's a few skins for Stranger Things Demogorgon. It always looks like Demogorgon. There's a few skins for Michael Myers. It always looks like Michael Myers. When you get to Behaviors, they own it. They develop the IP. So killers like Hag and Trapper, their customizations go nuts because Behavior's free to do whatever the hell they want. And I think that's kind of the element where you recognize that kind of owning your own IP probably better.
So who would in Final Fantasy, who would be the characters in Dead by Daylight?
Not Sephiroth. Probably
you say that, but I feel like that's the easy
one. No, if they did, it would be him.
Yeah.
But I'm thinking of someone who would make a more interesting sort of stalker villain. Genova actually just could be interesting because you can do some real body horror with Genova's character model. I think that would be a beautiful, beautiful idea.
I would say for the same reason, Seymour from Final Fantasy X.
Oh, hell yeah.
I think he would make a great Dead by Daylight villain.
Hell yes.
Especially given that like his whole thing, first of all, his obsession with death it just fits the game. But his whole character in Final Fantasy X is just annoyingly persistent. He's never tremendously powerful, but he just won't go away. He won't die. And I feel like that fits Dead by Daylight very, very well.
I'm falling in line behind Banana, Seymour.
Kind of like
and then you have to have the survivor. Yeah, yes. I feel like that's probably not a comparison that's been made before, but Seymour is definitely the Pepe Le Pew of Final Fantasy.
You heard it here first, gang.
Yeah. Yeah. But I think
there goes
there's
the rest of our subs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm actively unsubbing right now.
Yeah. Cobb
Very
just
good.
leaves the Discord.
I've had enough.
But with Dead by Daylight, there's always the counterpart. So Dead by Daylight just recently, well, the most recent one is Lara Croft. And there's not a paired killer with Lara Croft.
Right.
And I think with a lot of like the DLC that you see,
Be the
behavior
T-Rex.
release- Yeah. I think with a lot of the DLC that you see behavior release, they try to pair a killer and a survivor in it. Because you'll have players who only play one side. And behavior wants to make the most money they can, so packaging a DLC with both of them and then charging slightly more than just a DLC for one or the other probably makes them the most money. And you saw it with they just recently paired with Dungeons and Dragons, and this is why I say it would probably end up being Sephiroth if they introduced a Final Fantasy character, is because when they were introducing a D&D villain, there was really only one option that I could see them going with, and it was Vecna.
I was going to guess that, and I don't know D&D.
Yeah, exactly. And they went with Vecna, and I was immediately like, that's disappointing. Especially in a game where you have Stranger Things DLC. So the Demogorgon is a D&D figure. The Demogorgon from Stranger Things has almost nothing in common with the D&D Demogorgon. The same is true for Vecna. Vecna is a D&D figure that exists in Stranger Things, and the Stranger Things Vecna has almost nothing in common with the D&D version. And that was one of my biggest oppositions to bringing Vecna into DBD. But it's the obvious one, and it's the one they went with. And then the survivor that they paired it with is just an elf. That felt lazy to me as well.
An elf, an unnamed elf.
She has a name.
Yeah,
I think it's
I probably gave them a
Street,
name.
something along those lines. But yeah, so I think there's skins for that character, that there's a male version and female version, but it's like an elf bard that there's no lore around the character as far as I know.
Right.
That entire DLC for DBD felt lazy to me.
Like they couldn't have picked Drizzt or any other.
See, yeah, that's exactly what I would have thought. And if you're, because of D&D's kind of nature, I feel like digging into the lore and picking a lesser known character would have been far more appreciated. So picking Drizzt's allies would have been wonderful. Anybody from like the Dark Alliance game would have been very much appreciated by diehard fans of that lore. And they went with Vecna, which everybody kind of saw coming, and someone.
Yeah,
that's your other character, someone.
Well, any other thoughts about Final Fantasy and why you should play it in 2024? Maybe.
Yes,
we are only
always
thoughts of Final Fantasy. Listen to the other podcasts; it comes up. I think that's why I don't feel the need to sort of like throw them out and regurgitate my opinions. I know we'll make room for them later. I know it'll come back up. You can say for almost everyone that if you don't find the Final Fantasy for you when you play one, there's probably another that will fit. Because they're all very, very different, and even some of them, maybe you don't like turn-based games as a rule. Well, if you don't, the more modern generation of Final Fantasy games will probably start to appeal to you. Maybe it's the inverse. And also, don't necessarily take the general attitude or the general listing, the general rankings that people have for these games as gospel. You'll often find online the same lists appearing over and over. When we ask, what are your favorite Final Fantasies? 7's going to be near the top. 10's going to be near the top. 15's going to be probably quite near the bottom. 13 might be right down there. And I myself wouldn't agree with that. I think 13 should be much higher up the list. 15 should be much higher up the list. There are so many games, they're so different to each other. It's almost that the only thing linking them sometimes is the branding. The branding and some commonalities that they make, the SIDS, the Wedge and Bigs, and simple ideas like that. So if you don't find the Final Fantasy for you immediately, don't lose hope, because there may well be another one out there for you. You just have to find out which one was for you. And I think it's just a tiny bit of a shame when you think about it, that we went this entire podcast And we didn't even mention Final Fantasy VI, which is often called the best of the bunch.
I think when looking at the Final Fantasy series, regardless of what your priorities are in terms of the games that you play, there's probably a game that matches up. And that's exactly what Tom was saying, that like maybe the game you chose to play first didn't suit you as much as another game in the series, but it's almost certain that there's a Final Fantasy game that does appeal to you.
Okay. Well, I appreciate that. Well, I mean, I guess I'll close it right there. And I appreciate y'all talking about Final Fantasy 4. I know y'all don't like bringing it up very much. So
Yeah, this was a tough one for me. I
Really
really
will
had
force
to, push through.
Yeah. So we will see you guys for the next one. And if you like the video, of course, like, subscribe, make comments. It really helps push the algorithm. But we will see you guys next time.